Thanks, Kalani.
Big 12 open for business. They love their Cougars.
Mitch.
Welcome on in, Cougar Tracks podcast, powered by KSLSports.com. I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper. Happy as always to have you on board to the podcast wherever and however you may be listening to the show. BYU, Arizona State. A clash of old WAC rivals, meeting once again now in the Big 12 Conference. We're breaking it all down here in this edition of the show. I will be in Tempe coming up on Saturday. I will be there on location at Mountain America Stadium. I hate saying that, by the way. I hate saying Mountain America Stadium. It should be Sun Devil Stadium. But nonetheless, that's the official name now. I'll be there on location. Kickoff at 1:30. Extended pregame begins at 11 a.m. on KSL News Radio. We'll go live from Tempe. Myself, Matt Biamonte, will be there in the Valley to get you ready for the Cougs and the Sun Devils on game day. Interesting matchup in so many ways. One, it's a top 25 game. So many implications in the Big 12 with this matchup. And I'll run down the Big 12 championship game scenarios coming up here in the podcast today. But I love this matchup. And more so than BYU, Arizona, this game, BYU, ASU, to me has the potential for more of a rivalry feel because there's history there. And there are so many BYU fans in the Valley, the Phoenix area, that it creates a natural opportunity, I think, to, become something more than just another conference game. I think this could be a really intense matchup in the years to come. I hate saying, it's going to be the new rival. No, nothing like that. But I just think it's going to be a series that over time, this will be a lot of fun. And it's tough in these new supersized conferences and with roster movement so fluid each and every year to have that year after year, annual matchups. Really, the only game that can deliver the intensity is BYU, Utah. But I do think BYU, Arizona State is pretty cool. And I think it's going to be a really fun matchup, especially on Saturday. And, two programs that the media did not think much of going into the season. I had, on my preseason poll, I had BYU at 10. I had ASU at 12. So a little bit higher than the preseason poll, but still, clearly, I didn't think they'd be in this spot. I don't know if anyone did, honestly, except the people that are in those respective buildings. BYU 9-1, ASU 8-2. Cougs coming off let's call it what it is, a bad loss against Kansas. I don't want to hear that's the best 4-6 football team in the country, Kansas. No. I don't want to hear that commentary. That's terrible. No. Not acceptable. That was a bad loss by BYU to lose at home. ASU, on the other hand, comes in after a spectacular win, winning at Manhattan against Kansas State 24-14 in a game they were up 24-0. Both these teams very similar in their statistical profile. BYU averaging 31.6 points per game, ASU 30.8. ASU, on the other hand, though, is trending up. BYU, of course, offensively trending backwards. And Kalani's made it pretty clear that they just gotta finish the job. They gotta get these drives done. And I understand the complaints from Cougar fans for offensive coordinator Aaron Roderick. I think he's been a point of contention for BYU fans this week. My argument to that, and I talked about this on Cougar Nation on Monday, just that one game, and you can lump in Utah too, but Utah game I'm willing to have a little bit of a pass because that game's just always weird. I don't care who the OC is. BYU and Utah is always an ugly viewing experience that the offenses are never clicking at a high rate in that BYU-Utah game. So I'm willing to give that one a pass. But that Kansas game, the feelings Cougar fans had maybe of Roderick from last year, maybe the last 2 years, specifically last year, kind of showed up over the weekend. But if you just looked at that one game, okay, say it's a bad game. You're 9-1, move on to the next one. But those old feelings that they had for Roderick last year kind of reared its ugly face once again. And I think that's why Cougar Nation is really frustrated with Roderick at the moment, because some of the play calling was questionable at times. The fade call, of course, but that was Jake making that decision, that execution. Jake's got to be better too, and that's going to be important for BYU in this matchup. But I do sense there's opportunities for BYU's offense to bounce back, and I always like an underdog BYU team much better than a favorite BYU team that's got the pressures of the world weighing on them. I do believe that BYU is going to bounce back this week. I don't know yet if they're going to win or not. I still got to dive into this a little bit more, but I do get a sense that BYU's offense is going to play a lot better this week than what they showed the past 2 games. I'm pretty confident in that. If they don't, the season, then you're not going to the Arlington. Plain and simple. Like, if it doesn't show up this week, you're probably not going to Arlington. Now, I will tell you, there are some paths, potentially. If you go 0-2, you can still get to Arlington. I know, it's crazy. It is. It's wild, but it could happen. BYU's rushing offense can pick up some yards on ASU's defense. I was talking with an Arizona State insider with our sibling station down at arizonasports.com down in the Valley, and he even noted that the rush defense, a little bit the pass defense too, the secondary for ASU, they've been prone to give up some yards. They just had a really great performance against K-State this past week, but they're riding high now, and there's a lot of confidence. But how does Arizona State handle the pressure of having to deliver in a national spotlight game? BYU's been operating in the national spotlight for weeks now. ASU, this is now new to them. Just last Saturday, you got Desmond Howard going, why are we picking this game? Why? Oh, I guess I'll pick Kansas State. Like, dude, Arizona State's 7-2. But I'll admit, I was even kind of skeptical of ASU going into Kansas State. I had them 6 in my Big 12 power rankings. It wasn't like even I was giving much respect to the Sun Devils. I just thought, I don't see that spot working out. And some of the losses that they had, Texas Tech, Cincinnati, not great. But ASU's been really good at home. They've taken care of business at home. This season, they're undefeated, 5-0 in Sun Devil Stadium this year in Tempe. It's kind of crazy to think, first visit to Tempe since 1997 for BYU. Crazy. Because you would think that these programs would meet up a lot more. Now, there was that series. They had a home and home. I believe it was 2008, 2009. They had a home and home. But then that got removed. And I could be mistaking the years. It was either 2008, 2009, or it was 2009, 2010. Memory escapes me, but 2009 game went out the door to free up BYU Oklahoma, and rightfully so. That was an epic stage. Jerry's World, you had to take that. But then obviously the return visit to Tempe goes off the books because they're not going to do just a one and done. So that series ended, and then BYU was going to play in Tempe in 2020, but that got canceled due to COVID. So first visit since 1997. And just kind of a footnote on that, it was interesting this year, and I don't know if many people realize this, it was kind of noteworthy that the Big 12 kind of carried over the trends of these series, like who played where last, and then carried over to, this year, that the opposing team would then have the next home game. So, for example, BYU hosted ASU in 2021. They played this first Big 12 meeting in Tempe. The last BYU-Houston game was played in Houston in 2020. BYU then hosts Houston in their first Big 12 game. Kind of interesting, and that's how it all worked out. Same with Utah. Trying to think of who else was a similar carryover situation. Baylor, 2022. BYU hosted the Bears, and they play them in Waco the first time as Big 12 teams. I thought that was kind of an interesting tidbit this season. Arizona, neutral site, 2021. Didn't play them in Provo since 2007. They get Arizona in Provo. And it was kind of an underrated scheduling quirk that the Big 12 was aware of in putting together these schedules this season. But I'm excited. I mean, I haven't been to Arizona since 2006, and that was for the BYU-Arizona game. I remember as a kid, my parents went to the BYU-Arizona State game in 1995, and I thought as a kid, like, why am I not going? Why am I not going to this game? I need to be there. 1995, it's BYU-ASU. I need to be there. But, you know, that's how my mind worked as a 7-year-old kid. I needed to be at BYU football road games. I ended up staying with my uncle and then my grandma. I remember watching that game at my grandma's, and that was actually kind of cool because I watched that game late night. I think it was a Fox Sports Net game. And remember those? They had the grainy footage on Fox Sports Net. It always had this weird, I don't know what to call it, like a color palette that was just different. It wasn't as crisp as ESPN. But I remember watching it on Fox Sports Net late at night. I think it was like an 8:30 kick because it was a September game, so naturally played at night. My grandma's asleep, and I'm a 7-year-old just staying up watching BYU football against ASU. Because back then, night games never happened. That was not a thing. It was always BYU's playing at noon, and that's that. So a night game was kind of cool, and I remember thinking that was a lot of fun to watch. That BYU lost that game in 95. Arizona State had Jake Plummer. That was the beginnings of, you know, ASU's really good Rose Bowl team the following year in 96. Imagine if BYU and Arizona State had met the following year. It's really a shame. They met in 95, and then they met in 97. They didn't meet in 96 when both those teams were probably two of the best football teams in the country that year. ASU went to the Rose Bowl, lost to Ohio State, was so close to a national title. BYU won the Cotton Bowl, took down Kansas State that year. But there's just some really interesting history between BYU and Arizona State. You go back to, you know, the games in the WAC. The 74 game is an iconic one in BYU football lore. Helped BYU get to the Fiesta Bowl, their first bowl game with Gary Scheide, a real breakthrough under Lavelle Edwards. 75. I mean, like Arizona State was what BYU was in the 80s, in the 70s in the WAC. That was Arizona State. They were the powerhouse, and ultimately they were the ones, them in Arizona, go to the Pac-8. You kind of wonder, too, if BYU had the dominance in the 60s and 70s like Arizona State had, would the roles have been reversed and BYU gets the Pac invite? Probably not still because of the faith-based university thing, but it's an interesting thought. And now, after 4 decades where you would think Arizona State has the head start on BYU, BYU's had a much better football history, much better football success, and now they're met on the same stage in really a toss-up football game. It's kind of fitting. I think that it's really cool to see these programs squaring off again. I can't wait to see it. So much on the line in this game, too, and I think that's what makes this game fun. And honestly, for BYU fans, I think they got to remind themselves that one loss does not matter. And Kalani's used that messaging this week. This is not independence anymore. You don't have to worry about, one loss and your season's toast. No, the season has so much still in front of them. The Big 12 championship game is still within their grasp. Now, do I think that an at-large spot in the playoff is on the line? Probably not. I think if you lose a second game, sadly, you're probably not in the at-large playoff conversation. Unfortunately, it's a shame to think that that's the case, but it's probably the reality of the situation here. But everything's still in front of you. To get to the playoff, to go win a Big 12 championship, to play in the Big 12 championship game. I mean, when you talk about stakes, what's on the line in a game, this is the biggest stakes probably since the Coastal Carolina game. But understand with those, that was assumed stakes. We didn't really know if the playoff committee would catapult BYU into the New Year's Six at-large conversation. We thought they would if BYU would beat Coastal, but we really didn't know. As far as real tangible stakes going into a game, you're probably talking 2009. That's 15 years ago. And that's pretty cool to have something matter and to think of a power conference opponent, Arizona State, their market is hyped to play BYU in November. Like, when's that happened? When has a power conference team been jacked to play BYU in late November? When has any team really been excited to play BYU in late November aside from Utah and Coastal? Not really anyone. I mean, I went to BYU versus Stanford two years ago. Not a soul was in the stadium. Last independent game. BYU USC 2021, 10-win BYU team rolling into town. No one cared at USC. They were more worried about the coaching search. They got Lincoln Riley the next day. Like, I love that. And this is what BYU fans have been dreaming of for so long, is to go into energetic, environments where programs that have history, that have fan bases, are jacked to play BYU. And I remember thinking to myself last football season, I can't remember which game it was. It was in the Big 12, but a fan base stormed the field after a win. I'm trying to think which game it was. I can't remember. Anyway, it escapes me. It'll probably come to mind. But I remember thinking to myself, at what point does BYU get to a level in the Big 12 where an opposing team storms the field by beating BYU? We might be there. If Arizona State won this week, they probably storm the field. And if you're BYU, you want to avoid that from happening. You want to go in there and take care of business and win this football game and get to Arlington and show that you're a legit team. Because the logistics of how this schedule's set up, the Kansas win can be quickly erased from the minds of everyone by getting a top 25 road win. SMU at the time in week 2 was not a top 25 team. Heck, I thought they were shaky as can be. They looked suspect in week 0 against Nevada. I thought this SMU team might be fraudulent. They weren't ranked. Kansas State was legit, but it was at home. Oklahoma State, close call. That was at home. Oklahoma State, winless football team. The Utah game, huge win. Bragging rights, Big 12 championship chase, but Utah from a record perspective, not great. This is a great opportunity for BYU to say, okay, last week, total fluke. Getting it done on the road against ASU, and I think they can. And I really do believe that they can. I think this is going to be a game that goes down to the wire. It's going to be a close call. And it's going to be a classic Big 12 chaos game where something wild, I believe, is going to happen. You talk about wild. How about the Big 12 championship game tiebreaker scenarios? Unreal. So the easiest path forward, win out. With only one loss at 6-1 in league play, BYU, win these 2 games, you are going to Arlington. Take care of business against ASU. Take care of business against Houston. You're going to be playing at AT&T Stadium on December 7th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time in Arlington. Simple as that. Make it easy on everyone. Now, they can clinch a Big 12 championship game berth this week. What they would need to have done is they beat Arizona State first. Second, they would need Utah to beat Iowa State. And why the Utah-Iowa State game matters is because of a potential tiebreaker the Cyclones could have on BYU. If Iowa State wins its remaining 2 games, Utah and Kansas State, and BYU splits its final 2 with a win at ASU but a loss against Houston, the Cyclones would hold a tiebreaker over BYU on record versus common opponents. So if the Cyclones take a loss paired with a BYU win this week, the Cougars will clinch their bid to Arlington in Week 13. So, Cougar fans, are you rooting for Utah this weekend? Maybe. BYU does have a path to Arlington if they lose to Arizona State. What would need to happen is the following. If BYU loses to Arizona State this week, but then defeats Houston in the regular season finale, BYU would need Arizona State to lose their regular season finale to Arizona on November 30th in Tucson. Then Iowa State would need to lose either the Utah or Kansas State game to send BYU to AT&T Stadium with a 7-2 record. Another alternative, Arizona State beats Arizona in the regular season finale. Colorado and Iowa State both finish 1-1 or worse in their final two games. That would then create a BYU versus Arizona State rematch in Arlington. BYU's path to the Big 12 championship game if they finish the season 1-1 with a win at Arizona State and a loss to Houston. The Cougars would need Iowa State to lose one of their final two games against Utah or Kansas State to reach the Big 12 championship game. That's in a scenario that assumes Colorado wins its final two games. If Iowa State won both games, BYU would need to cheer for Colorado to lose one of their final two games. In that scenario, BYU would face the Cyclones in Arlington. And how about this one? This is a wild one. And I used Ben Williams' Big 12 Conference standings predictor for a lot of these, but this one in particular. BYU could get to the Big 12 championship game losing their final two games of the regular season. Here's how. If BYU lost the two remaining games in their schedule, there could be a path to the Big 12 championship game. If BYU loses to ASU and Houston, here's what would need to happen. Arizona State loses to Arizona on November 30th. Colorado loses to Kansas and Oklahoma State. Iowa State beats Utah and Kansas State. Kansas State beats Cincinnati and loses to Iowa State. Baylor, West Virginia, and Texas Tech all finish 1-1 or worse in the remainder of their games. If all those dominoes broke BYU's way, the Cougars would play Iowa State in the Big 12 championship game. And in that scenario, BYU would be in a three-way tie with Arizona State and Colorado at 6-3. And you would think, well, Arizona State's got the edge on BYU, right? Well, no. It would be a multiple team tiebreaker, which includes three or more teams. And you go through each level of the tiebreakers. The first 3 out of 7 tiebreakers, all 3 teams are equal. You get to the 4th tiebreaker in that multiple team tie scenario, BYU would ultimately get the nod. And that would be based on the strength of the conference schedule. BYU's conference opponents' winning percentage would be 43.2%. Arizona State, 42%. Colorado, 39.5%. And there you go. BYU could even lose all these games and still get to Arlington somehow, some way. My head's spinning from all of it. And I'm sure your head's spinning too, hearing all of that. But there's a path in any scenario. But BYU, make it easy on yourself. Just win these 2 games and get to Arlington. And I hope we see BYU in Colorado. How epic would that be, by the way? You don't want to get into the thought of that right now because, man, once you start thinking about that, you're like, oh, that's just so sweet. That would be an epic matchup. I really believe a BYU-Colorado Big 12 championship game would probably be the highest-rated TV BYU football game of all time. I'd have to look at the archives to see what the highest-rated BYU football game ever is. But I got to think BYU-Colorado would be all time. It's a 10 a.m. kick. You get all the college game day crowd watching that, and then it funnels in to the Big 12 championship game. Huge audience. And you got Coach Prime with a chance to go to the playoff. BYU. That would be legendary stuff. But it all starts this Saturday. BYU, ASU, 1:30 kick on KSL News Radio and ESPN. We'll have extended pregame coverage from Tempe beginning at 11 a.m. right here on KSL News Radio. I'll talk to you next time here on the Cougar Tracks podcast. We'll have practice this week. A lot to get to. And then Arizona State preview. I'm going to catch up with an insider with the Sun Devils to break this matchup down and a whole lot more. So subscribe to the podcast. Leave a 5-star rating and a review. It helps out the show a ton. Appreciate all of you that have done so already, leaving that 5-star rating. So I'll talk to you next time here on the Cougar Tracks podcast. It's powered by KSLSports.com.